Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. Iranian news agencies confirm the country's president, Ebrahim Raisi, and foreign minister have died in a helicopter crash. The death of hardliner Raisi adding further uncertainty to a region already in turmoil. Taiwan's new leader, Lai Ching-te, urges China to end the threat of war as he assumes the presidency of the democratic island. Plus, Asian stocks rise and European futures point higher as copper and gold both hit fresh records. Investors bracing for another busy week of earnings headlined by AI heavyweight Nvidia. Before we get there, the earnings front crossing on the terminal right now. Ryanair coming through a beat in terms of the full-year earnings for this airline. Full-year revenue coming in at 13.44 billion euros, above the estimates of 13.38 billion. Interestingly as well, Ryanair approving a 700 million euro share buyback. The final dividend per share is coming in at 0.178 euros. They saw customers coming in at 183.7 million customers. The estimates had been for 183.6, so a modest beat on the customer level. In terms of their forecast for customers, they see now a range of 198 million to 200 million, slightly above the estimates of 199 million, so seeing more demand. And in terms of the full-year load factor, that was also a beat for Ryanair. 94% was the load factor for the full year. The estimates had been for 93.6%. Too early in terms of providing accurate full-year 2025 profit guidance. That's the line as well, important coming through from Ryanair, saying it's too early to provide that accurate full-year 2025 profit guidance. And they say there remains a risk that Boeing deliveries could slip further. That is also key, of course, with that 737 MAX and the constraints around delivering those aircraft to Ryanair. We know that the analysts and investors are watching that very carefully indeed. There remains a risk that Boeing deliveries could slip further. We will be speaking, by the way, to the CFO of Ryanair in the next 25 minutes or so. So stay tuned for more details on that conversation on the back of those earnings. And, of course, a question about those Boeing deliveries will be up front and centre. Let's check in more broadly on these markets then. It's risk on across the equities space, certainly, and across commodities getting a lift as well. Some of that is tied to the geopolitics of Iran. Some of that is tied to the measures coming through from China. Further, pretty consequential measures to prop up the real estate market. Whether there'll be enough remains an open question. Nomura saying there is more that will be coming. European stocks looking to gains of 0.3% then, ending last week higher. FTSE 100 futures pointing to gains of 0.2%. S&P futures looking to add about 0.1%. 5,335 with Morgan Stanley upgrading their forecast for 12 months for the S&P to 5,400 just in the last few minutes. Nasdaq futures pointing to gains of 0.2%. Of course, another big week when it comes to the Nvidia story. Those earnings crossing on Wednesday. Let's flip the board briefly and look cross-asset. Euro-dollar. Euro getting a bit of a lift this morning at 127. The pound is at 127, I should say. Euro-dollar is higher by about 0.1%. The 10-year is at 441 on the benchmark. Copper up 3%. It crossed above 11,000. Again, a fresh record for that industrial metal. The short squeeze around New York continues, of course. And gold also hitting a fresh record, getting 0.9% in the session, 2,437. Part of that is the geopolitics, the concern, the uncertainty around Iran. Part of that as well, it seems, in terms of expectations the Fed can cut this year on the back of that softer inflation that came through last week. Let's go to the Iranian story right now, because Iranian news agencies have confirmed that the country's president, Ebrahim Raisi, and foreign minister have died in a helicopter crash. Search teams located the wreckage in Iran's mountainous northwest region. Let's go now to Bloomberg's Germana Bertecci in Dubai, who's been covering this for us. Germana, what are the latest then in terms of the details that we know right now, and what next for this country and its leadership?
That's right. Huge news out of Iran overnight. And it was only an hour ago that the state official agency, semi-official agency, MIR, confirmed that indeed the President Raisi, alongside the foreign minister, Amir Abdollahian, was also on that helicopter and had been pronounced dead. There had been a search effort underway throughout the course of the evening. Towards the evening yesterday, we had found out that a helicopter that had 9 passengers on board was engaged in a hard landing situation. Red Crescents were sent over to the location, but due to weather conditions, very dense fog, in addition to the mountainous terrain, it was very difficult for them to actually get access to the crash site. So it was only early hours of this morning that indeed we got confirmation that the Iranian president was on board and had been killed. So a very shocking development within Iran. In terms of what happens next, the Vice President Mohammad Mukbar is going to be taking over over the next 50 days as president of the country per the constitution. They're just following procedure here. But what is meant to happen is Iran should be holding elections within the next year or so after that 50 days is done. But it is very important and worth stressing here that it is unclear at this point who is going to be up for those presidential elections, because as per prior elections that have happened in Iran, every single one of the candidates needs to be cleared by the religious establishment, and we have not get a lot of commentary yet out of those religious leaders. One thing I would say is we did get commentary out of the Ayatollah Khamenei yesterday evening, and he was saying the Iranian nation should not be worried or anxious as no disruption will occur in the country's affairs. Yet to hear from him this morning, but they are trying to emphasize that there will be continuity despite the loss of their leader.
Jemana, on that point then, on the religious leadership, and of course atop that stands the Ayatollah Khamenei, as you just mentioned, there was an expectation that Raisi maybe was in the running to take over as the supreme Ayatollah of Iran. What does it mean for the leadership right at the pinnacle of this country then, potentially in the years ahead, and the potential ramifications of that disruption?
Absolutely. So President Raisi, also one of the more hard-leaning presidents in Iran over the last couple of years, was seen as a protege and also as a potential successor to the Ayatollah, who, of course, is in his 80s. And so there are questions at this point about who his successor could be. In the race, there was President Raisi and also the Ayatollah's son, Mujtaba Khamenei. And so at this point, people are saying within Iran that the most likely successor could be Khamenei's actual son. But again, given the politics, given the resistance perhaps from some of the clerics, there is still a lot of hoops that needs to get moved through in order for that to be confirmed. Yet to be decided, of course, once those presidential elections take place. But as of now, it does seem like the direct line of successorship would actually move down to the son. A lot of people are asking what this means for Iran's foreign policy. Could we see a huge change? Again, we have to remind viewers here that at the end of the day, most of the decision-making when it comes to foreign policy and national security defense was still taken by the supreme leader. A lot of the domestic decisions were taken by the president. But ultimately, when it comes to matters of foreign policy, things like engagement with Saudi Arabia, the relationship with Israel, the uranium enrichment program, a lot of that will still lie in the hands of the Ayatollah. So in terms of foreign policy, we're speaking to a lot of people earlier on the show. They do not expect there to be a major change.
OK, Jemana Besetchi with the crucial update there on this story that continues to unfold, of course, in Iran. Jemana, thank you very much indeed. You can track, of course, all the developments in this story on our website and on the terminal. Go to TLive Go to get commentary and analysis from our expert editors. Let's cross over now to Singapore. Avril Hong standing by with a check on the Asian markets. And it's risk on, Avril.
Yeah, it is risk on, but I think it's also worth noting how the developments in the Middle East, I think, starting to weigh a little on the risk appetite in the region, and the stock gauge is actually pulling away from gains earlier of about 0.7%. Even the Nikkei actually clocked gains of about 1.7% earlier, erasing some of that at the moment. But to your point about risk on, it was a really good handover that we got from US stocks, and we also got, remember, that China rescue package for the property sector in a way to kind of put a floor under the sector. So there were tailwinds coming into today's session, and might go some ways to explain why the Hang Seng is about 7/10 higher. But let's flip the board and take a look at the specific sectors that we're keeping an eye on today, because Infotech that earlier clocked gains of about 0.5% is among those that are underperforming. So it gives you a sense of maybe how the risk appetite is waning. Materials is outperforming today. That sector, think about how copper, gold, even iron ore have been performing, and no wonder then that these Asia material stocks are surging. Even energy counters are well in the green, even though the commodity is just slightly higher, as oil traders perhaps adopt a more defensive posture. Let's flip the board and take a look at these Chinese developers in Hong Kong, because we've been seeing that run-up whole of last week on expectations of policy support. We got that on Friday, and we're seeing still the gauge today is down. Now, there are questions still swirling about whether the size of the rescue package is going to be enough. How will it be implemented? Think about which developers will be allocated these funds. So a bit more cautious on the gauge of developers. Flip the board again. Let's take a look at what we're seeing in Japan, because we did get an auction for inflation-linked bonds that showed strong demand. And clearly it looks like these investors are still really worried about inflation. There are those expectations that the BOJ will work towards normalizing monetary policy. We're seeing bonds in Japan, 2-year, 10-year, both coming under pressure, bucking, I think, global trend that we're seeing. Tom.
Ebrahim in Singapore, thank you very much indeed. That's a nice touch point as well, because we want to do a deep dive on what's been happening in the global bond markets then. Japan, a bit of an outlier. They have enjoyed, if you put Japan to one side at least, their best month of the year, ignited by slower US inflation, of course, the print coming through last week. Here in Europe, though, investors are warning that the downward path for UK prices is not so clear. We get some really important inflation data out of the UK, CPI crossing on Wednesday. Let's bring in Mark Cranfield then from Bloomberg's M Live team. Mark, global bonds then having had a good month. You're looking at the 10-year now, and there's a bit more money moving into the 10-year, very modest in the session today, 441. Expectations maybe we get 2 cuts this year from the Fed, the softer inflation print, a number of Fed speakers this week. How comfortable are you with the repricing in the bond markets, and what are the risks ahead?
Well, really the biggest risk is just that investors get too far ahead of themselves. We've seen it a few times over the past couple of years when people think that the inflationary path is declining fast enough to have several interest rate cuts coming, whether it's from the Fed or the ECB or just in general across the G10 space. And it looks as though we're beginning to get into the same realms again, where several rate cuts are being priced in and maybe a little bit too much. So yields possibly discounting more than is really going to come on the table from the central banks. The first real test is going to be in just under 2 weeks' time. European Central Bank fully expected to deliver their first interest rate cut in this cycle, but there are considerable doubts about how many more and when the next rate cuts will be coming after that. We're already hearing pushback from several ECB people saying don't expect consecutive rate cuts from the European Central Bank. So clearly that market may be getting ahead of itself. Also, they have to discuss the timetable for winding down their balance sheet, which could be a little bit quicker than is currently priced into the market. So certainly the European market is one that could be too far. The UK as well. Again, Bank of England may cut interest rates in June, but the pace of cuts this year could be relatively slow, and the bond market may have overdone it in terms of expecting 3 or even 4 rate cuts. So that's definitely a major risk. And then, of course, there's treasuries as well, where how many times have we priced in a whole series of rate cuts and we haven't even had the first one yet? So we're going to get the June FOMC, where most likely the dot plots will have to change, possibly to just 1 rate cut. So wherever you look in the G10 space, there is certainly a risk of too much exuberance as far as investors are concerned.
Mark, is there too much exuberance when it comes to the equity markets then? Further gains in the session today. You had a really solid week last week. Nvidia with its earnings later this week, Wednesday. To what extent that's going to be a catalyst? How significant is, Goldman Sachs describes this company as the most important company in the world. What's your take on just how significant Nvidia will be this week?
It's very hard to argue with that, really, because there are very few single companies in the globe who can influence the macro markets. There are only 1 or 2, and Nvidia is certainly right up there. If you think what happened, the last time they did their earnings was in February this year. Since then, Nvidia stock itself is up more than 30%, is helped to drive significant gains across the tech rally, not just in the United States, but globally as well. So when you think of a company of a couple of $1 trillion worth of market cap has risen by 30%, that's a significant amount of global money which has been sucked into just one company and into the whole tech and AI narrative. So you can see if they were to wobble, if for some reason they disappoint, they do not meet outlook expectations in particular. Earnings, they may well be able to, but it's really where they're going to go in the months ahead. And if they don't meet expectations there, that stock could easily reverse very quickly. We've seen there have been periods this year when 200 billion worth of market cap has changed in one day, which is a significant amount by any standards. If we had any kind of reversal like that, we could drag down global equities for a few days. So there is no underestimating. It is by far the major event in equity markets this week, and probably for several weeks to come.
OK, Mark Granfield, another fantastic setup with a really important week, of course, for these global markets, with Nvidia front and centre, particularly when it comes to the stock story. From our MLive team, Mark Granfield, thank you very much indeed. Here's what else to be thinking about this week then. And it's a big week in terms of the politics, a focus on finance and geopolitics, of course. The G7 ministerial meeting on finance is taking place Thursday in Italy. We will be across that and reporting from that event for you. On Wednesday, it is the UK inflation print, CPI crossing on Wednesday out of the UK. And on Wednesday, the big one that Mark was setting us up for, Nvidia earnings crossing on Wednesday. We will be all across that story for you, of course. Coming up, Taiwan's new leader is sworn in. We're going to look at how President Lai Ching-te will sit right at the centre of that US-China rivalry. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now, Lai Ching-te has been sworn in as Taiwan's new president, putting him right at the heart of US-China rivalry. In his inaugural address, Lai urged China to stop its intimidation of the democratic island. Very pleased to say I'm joined now by Stephen Engel, Bloomberg's chief North Asia correspondent, live in Taipei. Steve, what tone then did President Lai strike in this speech?
Well, as I've talked to some people since the speech and during the speech, they said not many surprises in the speech. He reaffirmed the prowess of Taiwan's democracy. He said they're an MVP in the world of democratic processes. And again, as you rightfully said, he did sort of make that appeal to Beijing, urging China to stop military intimidation of the island and that they should work together to promote regional stability and regional peace. But again, you know, Beijing views Taiwan as a renegade province, and they definitely see Lai Ching-te as, in their words, an instigator of separatism and an instigator of war, I should say, and, working towards independence. And that's not necessarily something Beijing wants. It's why the tensions have ramped up. But let's look at the political situation here in Taiwan. You know, Lai Ching-te only won 40% of the vote in January because the vote was split three ways. His party lost control of the legislation by one vote to the opposition KMT. So he sort of starts this term on the back foot. He has increased pressure from Beijing and that rhetoric. He didn't really get a strong mandate as president, and he has lost the legislature. So he's going against a stiff headwind right now.
What is potentially at stake, Steve? You've covered this story for many a year in terms of the cross-straits relations with Beijing.
A lot is at stake, obviously. There's strategic importance, obviously, with Beijing ramping up its rhetoric that it will not allow and tolerate a separatist Taiwan. Keep in mind, this is the third consecutive term of an independence-minded party, DPP, winning the presidential election. Their favorite party, obviously, is the KMT. They haven't won since Ma Ying-jeou 3 terms ago, and it was Ma Ying-jeou who went to Beijing and met with Xi Jinping. So on the one hand, in a highly polarized island, you have one party going to Beijing and meeting with Xi Jinping and talking about how to cooperate. And then the other side of the island is saying, we're in essence independent of Beijing and China. And that's what he said. Lai Ching-te said that in his speech. He said, neither China nor Taiwan are subordinate of each other. So those are fighting words to Beijing. And I did speak to a KMT advisor, a special advisor to the KMT's chairman, Eric Zhu, earlier this morning. And he essentially said, don't provoke Beijing with this kind of talk, because militarily, Taiwan is not ready to defend itself yet. So again, you asked at the beginning, what's at stake? So much is at stake, geopolitically as well as economically, with all the big high-end chips. We just talked about Nvidia there with Mark Cranston. You know, Nvidia makes its chips here, TSMC, the world's biggest foundry, it's all here. So the stakes are high.
Steve Engel, our chief North Asia correspondent, thank you very much indeed in Taipei. Plenty more coming up in terms of check on this commodities rally, a look at tech space as well, and of course we'll be speaking to the Ryanair CFO. Stay with us, this is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Now, BHP, the world's biggest mining company, has until Wednesday to make a firm offer for rival Anglo American or walk away from that potential deal. Let's get more on this story with Bloomberg's Martin Ritchie. Martin, top line then, what are we watching for in terms of how this bid could evolve? Is BHP likely to come back with more to take over Anglo before that deadline then?
That's right, Tom. Deadline of 5 p.m. London time on Wednesday. We've had this big mining drama over the past few weeks with BHP rolling out two informal bids, which have been knocked back by Anglo. Anglo then setting out its own proposals to radically restructure its company. BHP now has to decide whether it's going to make a renewed bid. And as we understand, there has been no, well, as of at the weekend when we published an article overviewing what it's going to do, it hadn't really made a decision yet. Obviously, it has to weigh whether it can get the engagement from Anglo's board. I think the people we've spoken to suggest it wants Anglo's management to enter discussions. And so BHP really needs to sort of put pressure on the board, perhaps via the shareholders, to get involved in a discussion. That's one way of looking at it, and they could table a higher offer just to try and stimulate that discussion. But also, with this radical restructuring, as I put it, of Anglo, proposed by Anglo board itself, that's obviously going to give BHP some pause. It's sort of taken some of the wind out of the BHP bid, I think, because the proposal is really so similar to BHP's. And all of this, of course, comes against the background of record copper price. Copper price reaching above $11,000 earlier today. And as we know, the whole motivation behind this bid was for those copper mines. So it's going to be an interesting week in the metals and mining space.
Yeah, absolutely. OK, we count down to that deadline then, of course, and they had to make that decision by, as you say, 5 p.m. Wednesday time. Bloomberg's Martin Ritchie with the details on the BHP Anglo American potential takeover saga. How it could unfold in the days ahead will be closely watched, of course. Martin, thank you very much indeed. And of course, Martin was talking about the copper price. It is copper, of course, that's the gem at the heart of the Anglo business that BHP are angling for. And as Martin correctly said, copper crossed above 11,000. It's now at 10,981, up 3% so far in the session. Year to date, though, copper is up 28%. The short squeeze in New York leading to many of the shipments being rediverted to New York. And that seems to be putting further pressure on the price on the upside. 10,981 on gold, on copper. Gold, 2,440, also breaking through fresh records, up 1%. Part of it is geopolitics. Part of it is expectations around potential cuts from the Fed. Iron ore also rallying as well, linked to the property price story in China, up 1.7%. We're going to be speaking Nvidia, AI earnings with VC firm next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. Iranian news agencies confirm the country's president, Ebrahim Raisi, and foreign minister have died in a helicopter crash. The death of hardliner Raisi adding further uncertainty to a region already in turmoil. Taiwan's new leader, Lai Ching-te, urges China to end the threat of war as he assumes the presidency of the democratic island. Plus, Asian stocks rise and European futures point higher as copper and gold both hit records. Investors bracing for another busy week of earnings, headlined by AI heavyweight Nvidia. Let's check in on those markets then. Certainly in the equity space, it is risk on. We do have the Nvidia earnings crossing, of course, on Wednesday. We had inflation data out of the UK on Wednesday as well. But for now, the focus seems to be on expectations that the Fed can possibly go twice with cuts later this year after that softer inflation print last week, of course. European stocks pointing to gains of 0.3%. The FTSE 100 looking to add 16 points. S&P futures currently pointing higher by 0.1%. Morgan Stanley updating their 12-month view on the S&P, now looking at 5,400. Nasdaq futures also looking to gains of 38 points. Let's flip the board and look cross-asset then. In terms of the Treasury space, not a huge amount of movement right now in the session right now, but the benchmark is at 441. The pound is currently at 127, and the records have come through again. They continue to tumble around copper and gold. Copper, the story around the short squeeze in New York and those diverted shipments, currently at 11,000, back above 11,000, up 28% year to date, up 3% in the session. Gold at 2,443, up 1%. Part of that is down to the geopolitical risk, and we'll get more on that story right now because our top story of the day, of course, the Iranian news agencies confirming that the country's president, Ebrahim Raisi, and foreign minister have died in that helicopter crash. Search teams located the wreckage in Iran's mountainous northwest region. Let's get the latest then with Bloomberg's EMEA news director, Ros Matteson. Ros, thanks for joining us in the studio. What more do we know about the crash? What details have crossed in the last hour or so?
Well, we know, of course, this crash happened yesterday in very, very poor weather. I mean, the footage shows just how bad the fog was. And he was returning from this meeting where they were inaugurating a joint dam on the border area and returning, and the helicopter crashed. As you say, 9 people were killed in this crash. Raisi himself, his foreign minister, his security chief, a number of local officials, and, of course, the pilot and the crew. And that's all just been confirmed in the last couple of hours. What does this mean is the real question, both for Iran and the region. And there are questions for both of those in that. The first vice president, his deputy, will take over temporarily. He was installed by Raisi in the election in 2021. He'll just be a continuity figure for about 50 days until there's likely to be an election. The question is, does this change anything for Iran at home? Does it mean anything, of course, for succession? Because, of course, he was talked about as the main person in line to succeed the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, who's in his 80s.
OK, Ros Matteson, thank you very much indeed, of course, with an important update on this story. We continue to bring the latest details, of course, following the confirmation that the Iranian president did die in that helicopter crash. You can track all of those developments in this story on our website and, of course, on the terminal. Go to TLive Go to get commentary and analysis from our expert editors. Now to some other stories making news today. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has postponed a planned 4-day trip to Japan due to concerns over the king's health. News of the cancellation came after the state-run Saudi press agency reported that King Salman bin Abdulaziz is suffering from inflammation of the lung and will be treated with antibiotics. The trip to Japan was to have been the Crown Prince's first visit since 2019. Benny Gantz says he will quit the Israeli government if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu does not offer a new plan to bring back hostages and end Hamas rule in Gaza by June the 8th. The ultimatum from the opposition leader in the country's 3-man war cabinet comes days after the other member, Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, bitterly accused Netanyahu of failing to have a post-war plan. Analysts say the war cabinet might collapse, but Netanyahu would continue to rule with his far-right partners. Right, turning to tech now, and markets are standing by, of course, for those Nvidia earnings due on Wednesday. Results from the AI chipmaker, currently the 3rd most valuable company in the world, will be a key test for the so-called everything rally. For the details on what to think about within the tech space and how to invest, arguably, within the AI ecosystem as well, let's bring in Magnus, Grimeland, founder and CEO of international VC firm and seed funder Antler. Marcus, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start at Magnus, I should say. Let's start start on the Nvidia question. To what extent is it a catalyst for the kind of growth expectations that you're seeing across the tech ecosystem, or is it something of a suffocating presence? How difficult is it to invest right now in the startup space, given the dominance of some of these big AI firms?
Well, I think it's certainly one of the biggest opportunities in the world right now. The way we look at it is there are three big opportunities within the space. Is infrastructure, where Nvidia operates. It's infrastructure in the way that you have the models that are going to build the infrastructure of the future, whether are general models like OpenAI or specific models for discovery of new medicines or science, or infrastructure as Nvidia with chips, but also data centers and so on. So it's general infrastructure, one big bucket, very interesting. It's where you're going to see the next trillion-dollar companies. There aren't going to be that many of them. A lot of people are trying, and you really need the best people in the world to win in that space. The second area we find interesting is the apps that you build on top of that infrastructure. And there you'll see way more companies. You'll see hundreds, if not thousands, of 100 million plus, billion-dollar plus companies building on top of this infrastructure, which is currently being laid out. And the third big bucket is AI enablement. So I think any startup these days need to have part of their business being AI enabled. I think any big company to succeed also needs to do so. So those are the kind of three big buckets as we see. And we were one of the most active AI investors in the world last year, and look forward to the next few years as this is definitely not a short trend. This is the next 10 to 20 years.
Magnus, across those three different buckets, and I'm thinking whether it's the models or the infrastructure, the hardware that underpins them, or indeed those applications that we're now seeing being built on top of those foundation models, you want to be investing in all those different components, or is there a particular part of the ecosystem that you think has the most opportunity, at least right now?
Well, so I think bucket three is a necessity. So I think whether you're an existing business or you're investing in new businesses, you need to be AI enabled, otherwise you won't be able to compete. Then bucket one or two, it's a great opportunity to invest in both of them, but you gotta approach it differently. So if you're investing in bucket one, infrastructure, you need to really be backing sector experts, people who are really deep in that, people who are AI experts who spent many, many years researching, who are leading in the world at what they're doing. So in bucket one, you really need to back the best in the world. In bucket two, you can back founders who doesn't necessarily have the AI background, but they're building applications on top of the infrastructure in the same way as you saw with cloud, as you saw with mobile, as you saw with the internet. There are infrastructure players that are really the best in the world at what they're doing, and that's where you see the next trillion-dollar companies. But on the application side, you can really back just tremendous founders with a tremendous amount of grit and operational experience to build on top of that infrastructure. So that's the way we look at it. Number three is a necessity. Okay. Number one, very interesting. And number two, probably the biggest one in terms of volume.
Okay, interesting. Magnus, I was speaking to the CEO of Google DeepMind a couple of weeks ago. He said AI is overhyped in the short term, but underappreciated in the long term. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, I think it's definitely true. There is a fourth category where there's a lot of founders who just throw AI into their pitch deck. That's the one to avoid, and that always happens in hyped environments. But if you look at the opportunities within bucket one and two, infrastructure and apps on top of the infrastructure, it's the biggest opportunity of our generation, and it's going to take time, and over time it will be much bigger than any of us think.
Okay. I wonder what your take is on the concerns from some regulators and others that big tech is a stifling presence in terms of potential innovation and competition, with the likes of Microsoft investing in not just OpenAI but Mistral over in France. Of course, Nvidia themselves have become almost kind of VC-like in terms of their investments. Amazon investing in Anthropic, for example. Is that a potential threat to competition, or does it provide you with the opportunity for some pretty valuable exits?
I think it creates tremendous opportunities for valuable exits. I do think that over the last kind of 100 years, Western governments and also now in emerging economies have put together good regulation to ensure that there aren't dominance of big players. At the same time, we don't want to stop M&A activity and exits and these investments. I think it's really good for the ecosystem. And then I think people tend to overestimate the resilience of really big companies, right? if you go 20, 30 years back in time, there were some of the world's big companies then, IBM, for example, that obviously now are not dominating the industry that they were dominating at the time. And I think you'll see the same with Apple, Google, Amazon, and these players. Somebody's going to come there and disrupt them now, and AI is enabling that in a way we haven't seen before. So I wouldn't be too worried about it. I think it's actually good for the ecosystem. And as long as they're not breaking any existing rules, I hope there's not going to be too much regulation in way for innovation, because if anything, that hurts startups more than the big companies.
Okay, interesting. Magnus, what are you seeing in terms of exits this year? Do you see a pickup in terms of your pipeline of exits?
Definitely. I think what you're seeing, first of all, you're seeing VC activity pick up quite significantly. For example, we made 8 investments in New York in January. By March 15, we already had 7 of them had a markup. So more and more deals are being made in the VC space, and that will spread to the rest of the world. The US tends to open faster than others, and then it spreads quickly. So definitely not seeing that in the data from the last quarters yet, but you'll see it in the data for the next quarters. In terms of M&A activity and IPOs, it will still take a bit of time until that comes back to normalcy. But there's very, very healthy secondary markets out there. You're also seeing asset managers buying assets from each other, operating in different parts of the value chain. And that activity has really picked up. So for great companies out there, there's still greater liquidity opportunities. And it's higher than last year, and last year was higher than 2022. So I think we're on the path to upward trend. And you were speaking about the potential rate cuts coming up later this year, which will add fuel to the fire.
Okay, and when it comes to your LPs, Magnus, you've got some big names in terms of your limited partners. Is there a sense of, are they cautious at this point? What is their mood right now? What is the funding environment more broadly within your ecosystem looking like?
Well, I think if you look at the times we're in right now and you compare it to the past, if you look at 2001, 2, 3, if you look at 8, 9, 10, after the dot-com boom and crash and after the global financial crisis, if you look at the money put into venture in that period of time, comparing to the average of the last 30 years, it's a 2x return. So it's always better to deploy capital in these times. So 2022, 23, 24, probably if you look at it in retrospect 10 years from now, it's probably going to be some of the best venture years ever. At the same time, there's a tendency at this time for capital, as you well know, to go to more traditional, more secure yield-generating assets. And that's obviously still the case with the rates being so high. There are great opportunities across the spectrum. At the same time, we've seen a tremendous amount of interest in the early stage and the place we operate in. We are in the process of closing a number of our Fund 2s, who tend to be 3 to 5 times the size of Fund 1s. So there is still a lot of capital out there that are seeking to back the next generation great founders. And historically, these types of periods just after peak tend to be the best time to do that. So yeah, I really encourage everyone to look early stage these days.
Okay, Magnus Grimeland, founder and CEO of Antler. Thank you very much for your time joining us out of Sydney on the funding environment, of course, the catalytic effect, I should say, of Nvidia, and of course the shift to all things AI. We appreciate it. Later today, Bloomberg Technology's Ed Ludlow is going to sit down for an exclusive cross-platform joint interview with Dell CEO Michael Dell and Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang and ServiceNow CEO Bill McDermott in Las Vegas. Catch that 25-minute conversation from the Dell World Conference at 7:15 p.m. UK time. There's plenty more coming up. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now to some of the other stories making news this Monday. The UK government says it will use a major summit on AI regulation in South Korea this week to make a fresh push on reducing the risks around the technology. The move by the UK follows the government's summit on AI safety last year. The UK has sought to take a position of global leadership on managing the risks and opportunities around the development of the emerging technology. A survey by Ernst & Young has found London still leads European cities in attracting foreign direct investment in financial services. The UK's share of new projects has reached the highest level in a decade, with London securing 81 projects in 2023. That's 76% more than the previous year and more than double that of second-place Paris. However, a report by the consultancy says the French capital is likely to challenge London's dominance in the coming years. Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin has resumed sending tourists to space, launching 6 private passengers on a short flight more than 100 kilometres above the Earth. The passengers included Ed Dwight, a former Air Force captain who in 1961 was selected as the first black astronaut candidate. The company plans to debut a much larger and more powerful rocket later this year, capable of launching cargo to orbit. Let's check in now on the markets with a particular lens on commodities, because the price action is continuing to be quite eyebrow-raising, particularly around copper, crossing back above 11,000, as you can see, up 3.5%, just shy of 3.5% so far in the session. Copper is up 28% or thereabouts year to date. The short-selling, short-squeeze story that continues to focus on New York means that a lot of the deliveries around Asia are being diverted to the US, to New York, to make up, of course, for that short squeeze. They've had to get those inventories on board, and that is leading to price pressures continuing. And, of course, the expectation that the renewable shift longer term will be demand pressure there and putting a floor on the prices. 11,000 on copper. Gold is at 2,449, currently up 1.4%, and a fresh record for the yellow metal. That is tied partly to what's happening in Iran and concerns there, uncertainty there, but also expectations that the Fed could cut. And, of course, weaker dollar helpful for the gold picture. Iron ore currently at 119 per tonne. That is up 1.5% iron ore, and that is at least partly as a consequence of the additional measures around the property sector in China supporting demand for iron ore. There's plenty more coming up. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Now, Ryanair says ticket prices in the peak European summer travel season may be flat to modestly higher. The Irish airline announcing a €700 million share buyback. I'm very pleased to say I'm joined now by the CFO of Ryanair, Neil Sorahan. Neil, talk to us about the summer pricing picture. We know there's capacity constraints, so on some lines it's unusual to see a forecast around flat to marginally higher pricing. Why is that, and when do you see that story turning around?
Yeah, you're right, Tom. We've got the Pratt & Whitney GTF issue is going to take a lot of A320s out of the market. Boeing and Airbus are running behind on deliveries and will likely continue to do so out into the 2030s. One would anticipate that pricing would maybe be a bit ahead of where it is at the moment. That said, we're going to grow by traffic by 9% this year to almost 200 million passengers. And we're guiding fares in the peak summer months flat to modestly up. And that's on top of a 21% fare increase last year. But at the moment, we are having to stimulate midweek traffic a bit more than we would have anticipated. Weekends, very strong. But I'd anticipate that, with the schools closing in the next few weeks, that we'll start to see the midweeks close out as well. But we're taking in over 600,000 bookings a night. So demand is huge. And my advice would be to yourself, Tom, and everybody else, book sooner rather than later, because I think fares are only going to go in one direction.
But for a bit more detail on that, Neil, then, and we'll take that advice on board, where do you see more positive price pressure coming through for you in the business in the quarters ahead? When does that become more substantial?
Well, I mean, the peak months for us are the July, August, September, and they're booking well at the moment, albeit that we'd only have, over 30% of those bookings in place at this point in time, which is not unusual for the time of year. But we would anticipate that they'll be very strong into the summer. So that's why we're saying fares flat to modestly up into the peak summer months.
OK, so you're booking, just above 30% for the summer season so far for Ryanair. I think we were speaking to EasyJet last week. They said about 39% for the summer season. Neil, in terms of the deliveries, there's another line crossing from the earnings story then around Ryanair saying there's a risk, you've said, and you and the team, there's a risk that there's further slowdown in deliveries of those Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. Can you give us a bit more detail on that? We'd heard that you had maybe 2 or 3 that could be delivered by June. Is that still on track?
Yeah, as things stand, we would hope to have 158, maybe if we're lucky, 160, 161 game changers in the fleet by the end of July. That's roughly 20, 23 aircraft shy of where we had hoped to be at that point in time. But we're very pleased with how things are going with Boeing at the moment. The new management team, led by Stephanie Pope in Seattle, are producing higher quality aircraft, and the consistency of deliveries is getting better. So, I'd be hopeful that we'll be closer to the 160 aircraft by the end of July, and then, we'll hopefully catch up the shortfall of 20 aircraft by November timeframe, which means there's only 29 aircraft left in our 210 aircraft order for the game changers, and they'll come in ahead of summer of 2025, and then hopefully by 27 we start taking delivery of the first of our 300 aircraft order for the MAX 10s.
Neil, you're announcing as well a €700 million buyback. Is that where you're leaning in the quarters ahead as well? Do you want to be returning more cash to shareholders rather than looking at M&A? Talk to us about the rationale behind that.
Yeah, well, we've been very clear. I mean, our capital allocation policy is very straightforward. First priority was to restore pay for our people after COVID, and then introduce pay increases for them, pay down lots of debt, and we paid down over $1 billion in debt last year, and to fund ourselves out of our own cash resources, and we funded our $2.4 billion in capital expenditure last year out of cash. So to the extent that we've surplus cash thereafter, we said we would return it to the shareholders. We implemented a regular dividend policy last November, and this morning we're delighted to say that we'll be buying back $700 million worth of shares. Ryanair's traditionally participated in buying low-cost aircraft at the right time. We've got a very good order book. We've got the 300 game changers, which will underpin our growth to 300 million passengers over the next decade. Okay. And we don't tend to participate in M&A unless it brings something that we can't necessarily achieve quickly ourselves.
Okay. Neil, we've got to leave it there. Really appreciate your time this morning on the back of those earnings. Neil Sorahan, CFO of Ryanair. Up next, it is Markets Today. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.